Here is the rewritten version, with slight word changes only, same length and flow, no headings, and simple English, while keeping the story intact and detailed. A woman hugs her son in 1931, but when you look closely at the boy's face, something does not feel right. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully studied the old photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian archives earlier that morning. The black and white image, dated 1931, captured what looked like a gentle, loving moment. A woman wearing a plain cotton dress held a young boy, likely around 8 years old, in her arms. They stood in front of what seemed to be a small farmhouse, possibly somewhere in rural Kansas, judging by the flat land and wooden fence stretching behind them. Just another Depression-era family photo, Margaret quietly said to herself, noticing the woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothes, clear signs of hard times. The photograph had been donated by the estate of Elenina Hartwell, along with many other family keepsakes from the early 1900s. But as Margaret picked up her magnifying glass to check the photo's condition for preservation, something stopped her. The woman's face showed real motherly love, her arms wrapped tightly and protectively around the child. Her expression was gentle and warm, exactly what you would expect from a mother holding her son. The boy, however, felt different. Margaret leaned in closer, her breath slowing as the woman looked down at him with clear affection. The boy's eyes stared straight ahead with a sharp intensity that felt disturbing for someone so young. His small hands, which should have rested naturally in his mother's embrace, appeared stiff and tense at his sides. "That's strange," she whispered, moving the desk lamp to shine more light on the photograph. The longer she studied the boy's face, the more uneasy she felt. There was something in his expression, not the innocent curiosity of childhood, but something else entirely, something far too grown up, too deliberate for an 8-year-old boy. In 1931, Margaret wrote a note in her research journal, "Unusual family photograph. Suggest further research into the Hartwell family history." She had no idea that this single image would uncover a mystery hidden for more than 90 years, changing everything she believed about a mother's love and the secrets families hide in plain sight. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving along the winding roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, toward the large Victorian home once owned by Elenina Hartwell. The elderly woman had died at 97, leaving behind a carefully organized estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield as someone who lived quietly but with purpose. Eleanor's great-niece, Sarah Morrison, greeted Margaret at the front door. Sarah was in her 40s, with kind eyes and brown hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a simple ponytail. She worked as a librarian in Philadelphia, but had taken time off to manage her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleanor's collection," Sarah said as she guided Margaret through rooms filled with well-preserved furniture and photographs. She cared deeply about family history, though she was always very private about certain parts of our past. The house felt like a step back in time. The wooden floors creaked as they walked past walls covered in family portraits spanning many generations. Margaret noticed that many photos were professionally mounted and carefully labeled in Elenina's tidy handwriting. She never married or had children, Sarah explained, but she dedicated her life to protecting our family's story. She used to say photographs were windows into the soul, revealing truths people would rather keep hidden. They entered Elenina's study, a warm room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk scattered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and handwritten notes. Sarah picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This may interest you," she said, handing it to Margaret. "These are Aunt Elenina's notes about the 1931 photograph you mentioned. She spent years trying to understand it." Margaret opened the journal carefully. Elenina's handwriting filled the pages with dates, thoughts, and unanswered questions. One entry immediately stood out, the boy in mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never did? The truth about Thomas must be hidden within these photographs. "Thomas?" Margaret asked, looking up. "Who was Thomas?" Sarah's face tightened. "That's the problem, we don't really know." Later, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee from an old percolator while Margaret spread several photographs across the kitchen table. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows over the images. "What I'm about to tell you may sound odd," Sarah said, settling into her chair. "Growing up, I heard hushed conversations among older relatives about a boy named Thomas who lived with my great-great-grandmother, Ruth Hartwell, in the early 1930s. But the stories never matched." She pointed to the 1931 photograph. "Some family members believed this was Ruth's son Thomas, who died young from influenza. Others said he wasn't her biological child, but someone she cared for temporarily. A few even claimed Thomas never existed at all, that the photo showed a different child." Margaret studied the image again, focusing on the boy's unsettling stare. "What did Ella Lenina think?" "That's what makes this so interesting," Sarah replied, pulling another photo from a manila envelope. "Aunt Ella Lenina found this one last year while sorting through attic papers. The second photo, also from 1931 but taken months later based on clothing, showed Ruth Hartwell standing alone in front of the farmhouse. She looked exhausted, almost haunted, her hands tightly clasped. There was no sign of the boy." "Turn it over," Sarah said softly. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." Margaret felt a cold shiver. "Left? But your family said he died of influenza." "Exactly," Sarah replied quietly. "That's when Aunt Eleanor realized our family had been hiding something for nearly 100 years. She became obsessed with discovering who Thomas really was, where he came from, and what truly happened to him." Margaret took out her notebook. "Did Ella Lenina find anything else?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a third photograph. "She found this hidden behind a mirror frame in the attic. It's dated 2 weeks before the first photo. The image showed Ruth Hartwell with a different boy, lighter-haired and smiling naturally. The resemblance between Ruth and this child was undeniable. This," Sarah said softly, "was Ruth's real son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this picture was taken." Margaret returned to Washington, D.C. with copies of all 3 photographs and Ella Lenina's notes, her thoughts racing. The next morning, she contacted Dr. James Patterson, an expert in photographic authentication. "I need you to examine these closely," she said when they met at his Georgetown lab. "Everything. The paper, chemicals, any signs of tampering." James, a careful researcher in his mid-50s, placed the first photograph under a powerful digital microscope. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "It's authentic. The materials match 1931 photography. But something about the image quality is unusual." Margaret leaned closer. "What do you see?" "Look around the boy's face," James said, pointing. "The grain pattern is slightly different. It's subtle, but it suggests extra processing or exposure." The second photo showed no such issues, but when James examined the third image, he froze. "Margaret, you need to see this." He overlaid the images on his computer, adjusting alignment. "Look at the background, the fence, shadows, farmhouse position, nearly identical." Margaret stared. "That means—" "And look here," James continued, zooming in, "the tear in Ruth's dress near her shoulder, the scuff on her shoe. These photos were taken far closer together than the dates suggest. Likely the same Margaret's heart pounded. "So you're saying—" "I'm saying these photos were probably taken within hours of each other." With this discovery, Margaret traveled to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwells lived in 1931. The small farming town still kept Depression-era records in its town hall. Mary Kowalski, the town clerk in her 70s, pulled out dusty books. "Ruth Hartwell? Yes, my grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Poor boy, always sick. Died of pneumonia in 1931. Mary examined the photos. "This is Ruth," she said, "and this boy here," pointing to James, "he looks like a Hartwell. Same hair, same gentle look." But when she studied the dark-haired boy, her face grew uneasy. "I don't recognize him at all, and I knew every child in town. There's something about his eyes, unsettling, like he's far older than he should be." Mary checked records. James died February 15, 1931, and there's no record of any other child living with Ruth. No adoption, no guardianship. She looked at Margaret seriously. According to records, Ruth lived alone after James died until she moved to Pennsylvania later that year. But these photos say otherwise. Mary suggested Frank Morrison, now 94, whose family lived next door. At the assisted living center, Frank reacted instantly when he saw the photo. "Dear God," he whispered. "I never thought I'd see that boy again. You remember him?" Margaret asked. Frank nodded slowly. "Thomas. That's what Ruth called him. He owed up a week or two after James died. Nobody knew where he came from. Ruth said she was helping his family." Frank's eyes darkened, but something wasn't right. He spoke like an adult, knew things he shouldn't. Even the animals feared him. Our dog hid. Ruth's cow would panic when he came near. Here is the revised version with very small word changes, same length and structure, no headings, and simple English while keeping the story fully intact. Animals sense things, you know. Margaret showed Frank the photograph of Ruth standing alone. "What happened to Thomas?" Frank's face darkened. "He vanished one night in late summer of 1931. Ruth never talked about it, but the next morning she seemed changed, relieved in some way, yet deeply troubled. Within a few months, she left Millfield and never came back." "Did anyone report him missing?" Margaret asked. "That's the strangest thing," Frank replied. "No one seemed to care that he was gone. It was as if the whole town silently agreed to erase him. Even Ruth behaved as though he had never been there at all." Frank leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But there's something I've never told another soul. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was walking past Ruth's farm late in the evening. I saw her behind the barn, digging into the ground. She worked through the night, using a lantern for light." Margaret called Sarah Morrison immediately after speaking with Frank. Together they drove to Kansas to find the original Hartwell farm. The property had been abandoned since the 1950s, but still stood on land now owned by a large farming company. The current owner, Robert Jensen, was a practical man in his 60s who had grown up hearing stories about the curse at Hartwell Place. He willingly gave them permission to explore the land, and even offered ground-penetrating radar equipment he used to check irrigation lines. The farmhouse was badly damaged. The roof had collapsed long ago, and years of weather had stripped much of the wooden siding away. Still, the stone foundation remained solid, and the barn Frank had mentioned was still standing. Its red paint faded into a dull brown. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning walking the land, comparing old photographs to the present landscape. Despite years of decay, they identified the exact spot where Ruth had posed with both boys, a slight rise in the ground that gave a clear view of the house. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn, Margaret reminded Sarah as they approached the old structure. The area behind it was thick with weeds and tall grass, but the radar would detect any disturbance beneath the surface. Robert Jensen arrived around noon with the equipment. The radar machine resembled a large lawnmower, with a screen showing underground shapes. As he slowly pushed it across the area, Margaret and Sarah watched closely. Suddenly, Robert stopped. "There," he said. "Something is buried here, about 4 feet down. Rectangular shape." Margaret's heart raced. "How big?" Robert studied the screen, about the size of a large suitcase. He paused, uneasy. "Possibly a small casket." Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm. "You don't think—" "There's only one way to know," Margaret said quietly. "We need to contact the sheriff. If there's any chance of human remains, this must be handled properly." As they waited for authorities, Margaret felt certain they were about to uncover a truth the Hartwell family, and perhaps all of Millfield, had tried to bury for 90 years. The wind swept across the empty farm, whistling through broken windows and moving the tall grass. In the sound, Margaret almost imagined hearing a child's voice, not playful laughter, but something far more disturbing. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within an hour, along with the county coroner and a state forensic team. Though Martinez had decades of experience, investigating a possible 90-year-old crime scene was something entirely new. "We must be extremely careful," said Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist, as her team prepared their tools. "If remains are present, they will be fragile. And if this connects to a crime, any evidence must be preserved." The excavation progressed slowly. Once the team reached the depth shown by the radar, they removed soil by hand. Margaret and Sarah watched from a distance, anxious and fascinated. After 2 hours, a technician called out, "I've found something." Dr. Chen knelt and gently brushed away dirt from a wooden corner. As more soil was cleared, a small handmade wooden box appeared, roughly the size of a child's coffin, clearly built by unskilled hands. "This wasn't professionally made," Dr. Chen noted, examining the rough joints. "Someone built this quickly, likely under great stress." Sheriff Martinez photographed everything as the box was lifted from the ground. It was held shut by a simple latch, worn but still intact. Before opening this, the sheriff said, "Everyone needs to understand the seriousness of what we may find. If these are human remains, this could be evidence of a crime from 1931. Dr. Chen slowly opened the latch. Inside the box, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but was now brown with age, were the clear remains of a small human skeleton. As Dr. Chen carefully moved the cloth aside, her expression changed. "This is unusual," she said. "The bones show abnormal development." She studied them closely. The skull suggests someone much older than the size indicates, possibly an adult with severe developmental issues, or... She paused. "Or what?" Sheriff Martinez asked. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. "The bone density suggests someone chronologically far older than their body size. And look here." She pointed to the skull. The teeth were clearly adult teeth, completely wrong for a child's skull. While the forensic team continued their work, Margaret received a call from James Patterson at Georgetown. His research into the photographs had led to a major discovery. "Margaret," he said, "I've been studying medical conditions that could explain what you found. Based on the skeletal details, this may be a case of progeria, or a similar rapid aging disorder." Margaret was unfamiliar with the condition. James explained that progeria was an extremely rare genetic illness that caused children to age rapidly, often giving them the appearance of elderly adults. In 1931, such conditions were barely understood. "But here's the key," James continued. "I found records from 1930 about a boy named Timothy Walsh who disappeared from a Nebraska state facility. He had advanced progeria and serious behavioral issues." Margaret felt the pieces come together. What kind of behavioral issues? According to records, Timothy had the mind and emotional awareness of an adult trapped in a failing child's body, James said. He was described as manipulative, intelligent, and deeply unsettling to adults at the time. Margaret understood now. What Ruth Hartwell experienced wasn't supernatural at all. It was a tragic encounter with a severely ill child whose condition wouldn't yet be understood for decades. "James, can you send me those records?" she asked. "I believe Timothy Walsh and Thomas are the same person." After the call, Margaret shared everything with Sarah. The truth reshaped the entire story. Ruth hadn't been facing something evil, but a suffering child whose illness made him seem frightening. In 1931. "So Thomas, or Timothy, died while staying with Ruth?" Sarah asked. "That seems likely," Margaret replied. "Ruth probably cared for him out of kindness. When he died, she panicked. People didn't understand progeria then. Authorities might have accused her, or worse." Margaret looked toward the excavation site. She buried him secretly to protect herself, but also to give him dignity he'd never had. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in Elenina Hartwell's study with Sarah. After days of reviewing medical records, town files, and Elenina's notes, the full story was clear. The mystery that began with one unsettling photograph revealed a deeply human tale of compassion, fear, and sacrifice. Forensic analysis confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child around 10 years old, with bone and dental features of someone far older. DNA comparisons with the Walsh family strongly suggested Thomas was Timothy Walsh. "Eleanor suspected the truth," Sarah said, reading from her aunt's final notes. She wrote, "Ruth saved that boy from a life of suffering. When it ended, she gave him the burial he deserved. Margaret arranged for Timothy Walsh to be reburied in Millfield Cemetery with a proper headstone. The inscription read, Timothy Walsh, 1920 to 1931. A child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace. The photograph now made sense. Ruth's love was real. Timothy's unsettling expression reflected pain and confusion, not evil. Ruth had seen past his appearance and given him comfort and dignity. Ruth was a hero, Margaret thought, placing the photograph into an archival sleeve. It would be displayed with its full story, not as a mystery, but as proof of human kindness. The boy's face no longer felt disturbing. Margaret now saw what Ruth had seen, a child who needed care and to be remembered. In the end, the photograph revealed its truth. Sometimes, what feels wrong is simply something we do not yet understand.